Professor Dave here. Let's talk about feelings.
He knows a lot about the science stuff. Professor Dave explains.
All the creatures in the animal kingdom exhibit certain types of behavior, but only a small portion of those creatures experience what we would describe as emotions. These are instinctive or intuitive states of mind that are symptoms of complex cognitive function. Many or most mammals display emotional states, and humans are no exception. We can be angry, joyful, depressed, or fearful, and these states of mind are not always direct reflections of reason. Why do we feel feelings? If everything about our anatomy and physiology makes some amount of sense in an evolutionary context, what is the benefit of possessing emotions? What purpose do they serve in the sense of survival? An analysis of emotional responses in animals goes back all the way to the time of Darwin himself. He compared such responses in a variety of species and proposed that expressions of emotion evolved in an organism so as to signal to other organisms what it was about to do next. For example, when an animal is feeling threatened, it may display a stance of aggression. It may bare its teeth. It may lean forward and make aggressive sounds. All of this behavior is to indicate the potential for violent behavior, and it does well in intimidating some percentage of other organisms nearby, which may then retreat in fear without necessitating actual combat. Thus, this type of behavior has a quantifiable impact on the survival of the organism, and therefore becomes a preferable trait within the gene pool. Submission is the opposite of aggression, and thus is expressed in the opposite manner physically, with downward posture, an aversion of the gaze, and other behaviors that communicate the lack of a physical threat. This can also serve a survival purpose in reducing the chances of a confrontation. Emotional states catalyze these behaviors, and it is in this context that we can understand how emotions must have evolved in animals. How does this work in the brain? The first theory that attempted to explain this was the James-Lange theory in the late 19th century. This states that sensory stimuli are received by the cortex, which in turn activate both the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system, and these responses in turn trigger the experience of emotion in the brain. This means that physiological states create emotion. This was sort of the opposite of common sense, which would seem to dictate that the emotion produces the physical response. Nevertheless, the theory maintained that it is autonomic activity, like change in heart rate and other involuntary responses, that trigger the emotional state. So whereas common sense would suggest that when perceiving danger, like a bear, one would feel fear, which would cause physiological reactions, instead, the James-Lange theory would propose that seeing the bear would trigger the physiological reactions first, which then trigger the feeling of fear. A bit later, the Cannon-Bard theory proposed instead that the stimuli trigger both the physical expression of the emotion and the emotional state itself as parallel processes. This would mean that seeing the bear would trigger both the physical and emotional response simultaneously and independently. However, modern studies have shown that neither of these models can be totally accurate, and it would seem that perception, experience of the emotion, and the physical response can all influence one another, which means a diagram like this is more reasonable. Another important theory relates to the limbic system. This is comprised of the amygdala, mammillary body, hippocampus, fornix, cortex of the cingulate gyrus, septum, olfactory bulb, and hypothalamus. This theory proposes that emotional states are expressed when these structures act on the hypothalamus and are then experienced through their action on the cortex. Surprisingly, certain aspects of emotional response are consistent across not just humans, but even other primate species. An excellent example of this is facial expressions. It is proposed that there are 6 primary expressions that correlate with anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise, and that any other expression is some mixture thereof. The facial feedback hypothesis even proposes that simply enacting a particular facial expression can influence the onset of the corresponding emotion, and there exists some evidence to support this. When it comes to studies of emotion, most research focuses on fear. This is the emotional reaction to any kind of immediate threat. It is the easiest emotion to study because it is simple to infer from the behavior of many different species. Fear tends to produce either defensive behaviors, meant to protect the organism from harm, or aggressive behaviors, meant to threaten or harm the threat itself. These are instinctual behaviors that have evolved for survival purposes, and they take on a variety of forms in different mammalian species, though they often obey the target site concept. This means that the behaviors are meant to attack specific places on a threatening organism while protecting certain vulnerable areas of oneself. Aggressive behaviors can be predatory for eating or social, so as to establish and maintain a social hierarchy, typically among males, hence the so-called alpha male that exists in communities of certain animals. Defensive behaviors are more varied. They can be intraspecific, defending against social aggression. Freezing and flight involves staying perfectly still when a threat is perceived until a certain safety zone is penetrated, at which point the organism will attempt to flee rapidly. Animals engage in risk assessment, scanning the environment defensively. Some burrow into the ground and hide. And of course, there are maternal defensive behaviors, whereby a mother will instinctively protect their young, at times in so violent a manner that it resembles male social aggression. Social aggression in most species is exhibited very prominently in males, typically much more so than in females, with the exception of the aggression associated with a mother protecting her young. This is because the period in which testosterone is released in males around birth seems to have an effect on the organization of the nervous system, which is reinforced by further testosterone release around the time of puberty. However, the correlation between testosterone and aggression is still being studied and is far from conclusive. Our understanding of fear on a mechanistic level is quite a bit more sound due to studies utilizing fear conditioning on rats, which is the establishment of fear in response to what should be a neutral stimulus. This is a type of classical conditioning which we learned about when we discussed memory and learning. An example in this context would be the production of an auditory tone just before an electric shock is administered. The rat eventually responds to the tone itself with a variety of defensive behaviors and nervous system responses. The neural mechanisms that produce these responses can then be mapped through studies involving lesions in the auditory pathways. These studies suggest that signals such as the tone that induces fear must reach the medial geniculate nucleus and then travel from there to the amygdala, as lesions to either of these regions render fear conditioning ineffective. This makes sense in the context of our understanding of the amygdala as the region that receives sensory input and assigns emotional significance based on survival-relevant information. A number of pathways carry signals from the amygdala to structures in the brainstem that control the emotional response, like the hypothalamus, which directs the sympathetic response, and the periaqueductal gray matter of the midbrain that directs the behavioral response. We should, of course, note that the amygdala is not a singular structure. It is actually a cluster of nuclei, which is why we sometimes refer to it as the amygdaloid complex. Each of these regions serves a different function, as has been evidenced by studies on fear, demonstrating that the lateral nucleus is involved with conditioned fear, while the central nucleus controls defensive behavior, and so forth. From the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there is still much work to be done surrounding the brain mechanisms of human emotion. It appears that the brain activity associated with each individual emotion is not highly localized, but is rather diffuse. Each emotion, or even the experience of empathy when observing emotional states of others, is accompanied by activity in the motor cortex and sensory cortex. And finally, brain imaging studies show that similar patterns of brain activity are enacted whether a person experiences an emotion, imagines that emotion, or observes someone else experiencing that emotion. These realizations strongly inform current neuroscience research surrounding emotion and the brain. Finally, let's briefly discuss the stress response. When the body is exposed to excessive harm or threat, this initiates physiological changes known as the stress response. These are adaptive changes in response to the stressor that are beneficial in the short term but eventually have adverse effects on an organism. This response is centered around the anterior pituitary adrenal cortex system, better known as the HPA axis. Stressors stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, which triggers the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, and these are the signaling molecules that produce many of the physiological effects of the stress response. The sympathetic nervous system is also involved in the way of the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. The combination of these two systems is called the two-system view of the stress response. Stress responses are complex and they vary from person to person, but we do know that certain common psychological stressors relating to jobs, relationships, or other social obligations can have effects that are similar to physical stressors. In fact, studies have shown that social evaluative threat, which represents a context in which the self could be judged negatively by others, is the most reliable stimulus for inducing an HPA axis response, which makes sense given the evolutionary importance of close relationships. Excessive amounts of stress can result in certain disorders, such as the development of gastric ulcers, which are lesions in the stomach lining that can be very painful due to the high acidity of the gastric acid in the stomach, as well as cardiometabolic disorders. Stress can even have an impact on immune function, in that brief stressors can actually improve innate immune function, while chronic stressors have an adverse effect on adaptive immune function. The mechanisms by which this occurs are not well understood, but it seems clear that the two systems outlined in the stress response can influence immune response, as T cells and B cells have receptors for glucocorticoids, and lymphocytes have receptors for these too, in addition to epinephrine and norepinephrine, so the link does not seem far-fetched. But further investigation into psychoneuroimmunology will have to wait for another time. For now, let's move on and examine a few disorders of the brain. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.